Greetings. This lecture is going to be on organizational communication, specifically why communication in the organization is really important to helping us manage employees. What we're going to discuss time and time again, along with this idea of building trust, is that communication is key, whether it's coming from the top management team or coming from you to your subordinates, or you back up to your top management team. These communication channels are essential for success in the workplace. So we want to make sure that people are clear about what is considered good communication and how to do it right and get a chance to practice it. So we have a number of different things where we can see communication plays a role. Communicating corporate strategy and how important it is for everybody in the company to be on board with the corporate strategy. Interdepartmental communication. When we do goal setting with people, we need to make sure we're clear about what goals we're setting. Performance feedback and ensuring that people are getting appropriate feedback about how well they're doing on the job. Clarity of communication with suppliers and customers. And our list can go on and on and on about communication. So let's look at the process here. As you can see, it is a process where two or more people are sharing information. They use a shared set of symbols. These symbols can be verbal, using words, or they can be nonverbal, using a lot of different types of skills and tones and things like that and body language. The sender sends the message, and it's encoded in a particular way given what they're trying to communicate, or at least what they believe they are trying to communicate. Of course, there are influences. We talked about our perceptual process. Our perceptual process is that noise that you see on there, the lightning bolt at the top. That noise is what can mess up how your message is encoded. And it also messes up how it's interpreted on the other end. So depending on my baggage, my lenses that I'm looking at the situation in, my perceptual process, this is going to truly influence how that message is received. Now, we've all played the telephone tree game where a message starts on one end of the room. By the time it gets to the other end of the room, it's completely warped and completely changed. Why? Because of the noise, the context, the way people encode and decode messages as it gets passed along the line. Things do shift pretty clearly. So it's important from the point of view of messages that we understand how to encode messages as best as possible. There's always going to be communication flubs, but it's important for us to learn how to encode and decode these in a better way. So what makes up communication? 55% of our communication is visual, 38% of it is vocal, and lastly, 7% is verbal, meaning the actual words that you use. When we're talking about vocal, we mean pitch and tone, where your voice goes up or your voice goes down, or you sound angry or you sound happy. And that tone, depending on the words you choose, is going to change how things are interpreted. So the visual is also a key here, where we have a body language issues, where how we stand, how we sit in our chair, where we make eye contact, the clothes that we wear, and how we appear, what our appearances look like. These all communicate something about ourselves and what our message is. What is nonverbal communication? And we'll go through some demonstrations of this in class on Tuesday, but how we dress, if and when we touch people. Posture, proxemics, how close are we allowed to stand in proximity to somebody. Eye contact, paralanguage, hand movements, and facial expressions. All of these are examples of nonverbal communication. And as I said, we'll go through some exercises for you to kind of understand some of these in a little bit more detail on Tuesday. How do individual differences in perception affect communication? Well, as we talked about, the characteristics of the sender and the receiver in terms of encoding and receiving the message, the individual differences on both of those fronts certainly have an impact on how they're perceived. The characteristics of the situation also can influence how we interpret certain informations, and if we're making decisions under certainty versus uncertainty, it's going to change the way we perceive something.
Moving on to communication channels. The richness of the communication channels. Things that are low in richness are things like reports and letters and memos and pre-recorded speeches. People who are read-write prefer to communicate in formal reports and things like that. People who are much more visual prefer charts and graphs and face-to-face communication versus formal letters or formal memos and reports. Low richness communication channels are good for communicating information and passing along facts where things are not equivocal. Things are pretty clear, they're fairly straightforward. I'm communicating a message to you, here's what you need to know, here are the facts, thank you very much. Things that require interpretation, that may be a little equivocal, where it could kind of go either way depending on the nonverbals involved in the communication. We need richer communication channels. We need face-to-face communication. We need visuals. We need vocal. We need oral communication in some way, voicemail or speeches or telephone or you name it. So the problem is when you are communicating things that are maybe more ambiguous using things like email or letters or memos. Things can be misinterpreted very easily when you have a mismatch between the type of communication that you're using and what it demands. So for example, when we're firing somebody, we don't send them a memo saying you're fired. We bring them in face to talk about that. That's the appropriate match between what we need to communicate and the method that we use to communicate it. We also understand how email can be misinterpreted very largely. I will talk to you a little bit on Tuesday about some of the research that I've been doing in this arena, which is kind of fun, looking at how email certainly contributes to a lot of incivility, and particularly with global virtual teams, as well as emailing harassment. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in this arena. We know communication can go in a number of different directions, downward, upward, horizontally. It can be formal, it can be informal. We end up in challenges when we have two bosses, if we're in a matrix structure, particularly if we're a project manager, because we have responsibility to our bosses, we have responsibility to our project, and it's a challenge to sort of know how to divide your time and attention when you're in a matrix kind of structure. But there are also informal methods of communication, as you know, gossip chains and grapevines and cluster chains and things like that, where you tell two friends and they tell two friends and information disseminates that way. So we'll talk about how we can use formal mechanisms and informal mechanisms to get information communicated out to people. Verbal communication and nonverbal communication. What's important with verbal communication is A, knowing your audience. B, paraphrasing to make sure that you're clear that you've heard the other person appropriately. So you model by saying, so what I hear you saying is blah, 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 blah. So it's important to be able to paraphrase. Have cultural sensitivity and understand that there are differences in the way people communicate culturally, and being aware of that, particularly with respect to proxemics, what is considered appropriate or inappropriate, whether they're high context or low context cultures. Knowing your communication technologies, as we talked about it in the communication channels, whether or not email is appropriate or memos are appropriate, or whether face-to-face is more appropriate to communicate your message. Verbal communication also requires trust, and also issues of clarity, making sure that we don't have jargon or slang as we're communicating to people. There's nothing more frustrating when someone's got an in language and they're using it and you're looking at them and you're staring at them with big, huge, deer in the headlight eyes going, you just spoke a language, I had no idea what you were saying. Because they are priding themselves with their jargon and their slang, that they forget how to be clear about what it is that they're trying to communicate. And this becomes a particular challenge when you're dealing with metaphors and slang that's appropriate in the English language and someone hasn't learned that language as their primary language. They've learned it secondarily, and some of those metaphors get lost on them. Nonverbal communication, it's important to make sure we have consistency of intent and behavior, that again, we're using the appropriate communication technologies, and if we're communicating in emails, Do we need to use emoticons to get across that we're joking about something? There's a different language that we use in emails or written communication when it's more personal to ensure people understand our intent. And again, cultural sensitivity continues to be an important theme in improving communication. Our last slide is the idea of listening versus hearing. Listening means we are engaged in the communication and in the dialogue with the individual, that we actually are actively listening for content and things like that. Hearing means that there's noise around us. I hear lots of things, but it doesn't mean it has my attention. It doesn't mean I'm paying full attention to it. So if someone says, I hear you, they may hear you, but they may not be listening to you, which is important. So how do we engage in active listening? Well, we need to listen for content. We need to hear exactly what is being said by people. If we need to paraphrase back to make sure we understand that. We need to listen for feelings. We need to make sure that we get the emotion or the affect that's involved in that exchange. So we're listening to people's feelings. We need to respond to that. If you don't respond to the emotions and the feelings that are in that dialogue, it becomes the white elephant sitting in the corner ready to sit on you. Particularly if you're giving feedback to someone or if you're coaching somebody, this can be a very emotional experience for someone. If you don't acknowledge that they're uptight and they're tense and they're upset or they're angry or they're sad or they're depressed or whatever, you're never going to be able to get past that feeling to get to the content of what you're trying to accomplish. So the feelings can become a help or a hindrance to the actual feedback that you're giving to people and the actual communication that you're giving to people. So it's important that we work really hard on acknowledging the emotions. In order for you to be able to respond to someone else's feelings, you need to be aware of your own feelings. Being aware of your own feelings helps you to manage your emotions better. It helps you to be able to respond better when you feel your triggers being hit, and enables you to set aside your emotions in order to be able to deal with the emotions of the person with you. Because as you know, if I'm emotional and you're emotional, it has a symbiotic effect where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The emotion amplifies as opposed to suppresses. You start trying to out-challenge each other with respect to emotions. So very important for us to make sure that we acknowledge the emotions and respond to them. Don't let them just sit there idle. Identify that they're there and that you recognize them. Make sure that we're note all the cues, the verbals and the nonverbals that are going on in our communications. Watch people's body language and respond to their body language. We also want to reflect back and paraphrase. As we said, when we're listening for content, it's important to reflect back to make sure you're clear about what you heard. So we're going to get in class, we're going to do a lot of practice on this, and what I want to do as we go through the semester in our little role plays is to ensure that we go back to these key factors when it comes to active listening and communication. Is the person communicating clearly? Are they clear? The nonverbal and the verbal cues, are they consistent so that people can understand and interpret your intention? This is really important for you guys to sort of master as you come out of this class, because if you don't have this, it's going to be that much more challenging for you as you get out there in the workplace. So that's it, and I'll see you during our next class. Thank you. Bye.